Special Operations, Covert Ops, Espionage, The Team House, with your hosts, Jack Murphy and David Park.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 249 of The Team House. I'm Jack Murphy, here with David Park. And joining us for part two of our interview is Mike Vickers. Mike served in the CIA and 10th Special Forces Group, and we talked about that on last Friday's episode. Tonight's episode, we're going to talk about his time primarily at ASD Solic. He served as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low Intensity Conflict, and then went on to work at USDI. So there's actually a lot to talk about in his book, by all means available. Actually more than we're going to be able to talk about in this interview, but we'll try to get to some interesting parts. And Mike, thank you again for joining us. I'm sorry, do you want to do the ad reads?
Oh yeah, real quick, we want to thank our sponsor tonight, Fume. Fume is, look guys, cold turkey may be great on sandwiches, which it's not. Horrible copy. I don't know why anybody would ever go cold turkey. But there's a better way to break your bad habits. And we're not talking about some weird mind voodoo from your crazy neighbor or Jack's special 3-day boot camp that nobody talks about. But if you want to know about it, check out his OnlyFans. We're talking about our sponsor, Fume. They look at the problem in a different way. Not everything in a bad habit is wrong. So instead of drastic, uncomfortable change, why not just remove the bad from your habit? Fume is an innovative, award-winning flavored air device that does just that. Instead of vapor, Fume uses flavored air. Instead of electronics, Fume is completely natural. And instead of harmful chemicals, Fume uses delicious flavors. You get it. Instead of bad, Fume is good. It's a habit you're free to enjoy and makes replacing your bad habit easy. Your Fume comes with an adjustable airflow dial and is designed with movable parts and magnets for fidgeting, giving your fingers a lot to do, which is helpful for de-stressing and anxiety while breaking your habit. And I personally was not quitting any bad habits, but I love the Fume. It opens up like this. It's magnetic, so you can sit there and mess around with it. It comes with these little, kind of oil packets that when you breathe in, you're just breathing in. And it's nice because when you're stressed, sometimes you forget to breathe. So it reinforces that breathing habit. And they have a lot of great flavors. This is the maple pepper, which is just absolutely delicious. So check out Fume. Head to tryfume, that's TRYFUM.com, and use the code TEAMHOUSE to save 10% off when you get the Journey Pack. That's tryfum.com and use the code TEAMHOUSE to save an additional 10% off your order today. And then the other shout out we want to give is to Blades for Brothers.
Yeah.
And so look, Blades for Brothers,
just go check him out. It's Greg Corker's blade company. He makes these things by hand.
It's also supporting getting other veterans and first responders into blade making. They'll help find blade makers in your area. It's a great way to de-stress. It's a great way. He was telling us that his cognitive skills, his measurable cognitive skills on a test from mental health, or not mental health, but from the brain people, went up after he started making blades. If you're looking for something to do, you're lacking purpose.
What's the website?
It's bladesforbrothers.com. Cool. Check them out. And also buy some of his new knives made with 911 steel and steel from his miniguns, from his 160, or from his Little Bird.
All right. So, Mike, thank you for joining us for part two. We'll pick up kind of where we left off. You left the agency. You went and pursued your PhD, got into consulting. Tell us a little bit about your life after service leading up to kind of getting called back in once again.
Sure. So, yeah, the first thing I did was get an MBA from the Wharton School, and then decided to did a couple ventures, one an externally funded venture in the biotech instrumentation area, and then an internal venture in information services that did fairly well, and that financed the PhD program for me. And while I was completing my PhD, I co-founded a think tank, the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. I did the strategy part of it. And then I also started working for the legendary Andy Marshall, the director of net assessment for several decades in the Pentagon, working on a emerging revolution in military affairs, big change in the way wars might be fought over the next several decades, and the rise of China. And that took me up through 9/11, and then after 9/11, increasingly drawn into that world until President Bush asked me to come in to an expanded position as an Assistant Secretary of Defense.
So I want to start off a little bit asking you what ASD Solic is, because unless you kind of exist in the national security or the special operations field, there are some folks out there who don't know what that office is or what its importance is or the role it plays.
Sure. So after some of our challenges in the 1980s, the failed Iranian rescue attempt to rescue our hostages held captive in Iran in 1980, and then the invasion of Grenada led to a series of reforms. Goldwater-Nichols Act that changed a lot about the senior ranks of the Pentagon, but also a year later in the Nunn-Cohen Amendment, the creation of Special Operations Command, and also a civilian official, essentially a service secretary light, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low Intensity Conflict in the Pentagon, in the policy organization. And that organization continues to exist today with oversight over our Special Operations Forces capabilities and operations. When I was offered the job, just during my tenure, they expanded the position, an even more ungodly acronym called Assistant Secretary for Special Operations, Low Intensity Conflict, and Interdependent Capabilities, or SOLIC-IC, which doesn't sound good as an acronym, but it gave me policy oversight over all of the department's operational capabilities. So the strategic capabilities that had previously been under another assistant secretary. So nuclear weapons, space, missile defense, cyber, and then what was the Office of Force Transformation, how we needed to transform our military services, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, over the next 20 years. And then the traditional special operations counterterrorism portfolio. So it was a very big portfolio and a very, very good one.
Were these extra responsibilities that you sought out, or things that came to you? It sounds like maybe you were reaching for these things too. You had an interest in this.
Well, when I started working on the rise of China, and the revolution in military affairs, it kind of naturally gave me the background for this. But they kind of created the job or expanded the job to get me to come back into government to do it. So, in 2006, President Bush or his senior staff asked me and two retired four-star special operations generals, Wayne Downing and the other one, conventional force, Barry McCaffrey, a great combat leader, to come into the Oval Office to talk about Iraq strategy when it wasn't going well in 2006. And then coming out of that, President Bush called Secretary Don Rumsfeld and said, we should try to get Vickers back into government. And so after that, they created this position, and the Undersecretary for Policy, Eric Edelman, called me in and said, "Hey, you wrote this book on the Revolution and War, and we've got a job for you that combines this with special ops." It was flattery and stuff, but you're the only guy who can do this, so you have to say yes. So that's how it came about.
So there's one thing I do want to ask you about, or even, I don't want to say challenge, but I do have something that interesting that I think it's even on the ASD Solic website, and you mentioned it too, I believe, that it provides oversight but also advocacy for the special operations community, which on the surface of things to me almost sounds like a contradiction in terms. And I was just wondering if you could explain a little bit more, like how does the office perform these two functions at the same time, and what does that entail?
Yeah, so the idea, coming out of these reforms was to make sure that Special Operations Forces' voice was adequately represented in the Pentagon and the military services. And so, part of it was done by the creation of this hybrid combatant command. Special Operations Command is a unique command in that it is both sort of like a service and also an operational command with subordinate operational commands. But it does, man, train, and equip the things the military service would do for special operations forces, including procurement and career development and others. And it's had a very positive impact on the growth of SOF, but also getting SOF leaders into key positions, into the general and flag officer ranks and others. And then the ASD Solic, and in my day, Solic and IC, is really designed to provide the same function in the Pentagon, to integrate in all the Pentagon's processes. And, some people equate oversight with a negative term, but it really, at least from my point of view, advocacy and oversight come together in a sense of making sure that special operations are adequately funded, but also properly used and integrated more fully into the rest of the department.
And the DASDs under ASD Solic also provide like the Inspector General capabilities and things, if I understand correctly.
Well, they provide policy oversight, but they're more functionally aligned. So again, my day was different because I had people with nuclear oversight of nuclear weapons and force transformation and others. But there's typically a DASD for special ops and counterterrorism, and then maybe one for it changes over the years. It can be peacekeeping or stability operations and counterinsurgency that also integrates with the conventional forces when we're in that kind of war, broader policy in that area. And then sometimes there's a budget DASD that's, working with SOCOM on the budget, et cetera.
Mike, out of curiosity, you went from special forces to the CIA and then into these more leadership positions, and you had a great understanding, knowledge, and this breadth of knowledge for these types of operations. In that type of position, how important is that? Because a lot of times we see like civilians with no military experience and no intelligence experience getting put in these roles. Is that a deficit, or is it so more of an Overwatch position where it really doesn't matter if they have that experience?
No, I think it's very helpful. One, generally for policy advice at the higher levels of our government, to the Secretary of Defense, but if you're also representing the department in the White House and deputies, it helps to have an operational grounding. Most senior government officials on the civilian side don't. And, it just reflects the nature of our country and how, 1% of the population serves in the military, so you're drawing from a smaller pool. And it's very different than the world we found ourselves in coming out of World War II, where, everybody was a veteran.
Right.
Stuff. Several decades, we had a different government in some respects in terms of people who had experienced war and, had some degree of operational expertise. Now, to be most relevant, that expertise needs to be aligned to the problems of the day, just like our top military officials. You pick a great officer, but they might have spent their career preparing for air warfare against the Soviets, and then suddenly they find them overseeing a war against al-Qa'ida. They've got a lot of operational experience, not necessarily the right kind.
Right.
And so, effectiveness depends on that for, to some extent. But when particularly you're engaged in operations, it's just invaluable to have that kind of experience, at least in part of your team.
Right. Mm-hmm. And then one more question that I wanted to ask you last week, but I think it's really good this week is, you were very involved with the Afghan war, against the Russians. and understood a large part of what it took to bring them down. What were your initial impressions and then developing impressions with our war in Afghanistan?
Yeah, so it went in a couple of phases. It lasted over 2 decades. And, the initial takedown of the Taliban regime was really done brilliantly, combining special operations forces with CIA and then with American air power and the Afghan resistance. And it really allowed the Afghan resistance to, do a lot of the big ground campaign by that combination of assets. And so you had, depending on how you count it, a few hundred if you just take the CIA and special operators, maybe 400 plus, with an Afghan resistance that started only 10,000 or so and then built up a bit over time, defeating a Taliban force of 50,000. So it really was leveraging American air power and assistance and other things. And then, not to slight the Brigade of Marines that then Brigadier General Jim Mattis led into southern Afghanistan, you'd still only get to under 5,000 or so American boots on the ground. So a really, really successful campaign that worked in a couple months. The one unfortunate part about it is al-Qa'ida leaders largely got away, some to Iran and many to Pakistan, including Usama Bin Ladin, and we had to deal with them later. And then for the first few years of the war, it was pretty modest, and we made some mistakes by trying to build a centralized military force in a very decentralized country. Afghanistan is made up of a lot of different ethnic groups, and it's been governed historically decentralized for most of its history, and a small military. And so as the Taliban started recovering and coming back in, the U.S. had to take up more and more of the burden, and eventually leading to a big surge of forces that still couldn't win the war given the Pakistan sanctuary. And, so we achieved our objective at the end of 20 years in terms of preventing another 9/11 attack out of there. We had successfully transitioned, although I think it took too long, to building up Afghan forces and then supporting them. We did that by 2015, but then we just gave it away. In 2021, and allowed the Taliban to come back in, and that's the great tragedy of it. So it's a war really in multiple parts with different roles. Special operations forces certainly acquitted themselves very well in raids and building up Afghan forces and doing out in the rural areas with the Afghan local police and village stability ops, and so a lot of big contributions to the effort. But now, sadly, Taliban are in power.
So as you came in and took this huge portfolio in ASD Solic, I mean, the amount of things that you touched upon in the subsequent years is pretty dizzying. But I tried to pick out just a couple of them for the sake of the interview. And one of them that I wanted to talk to you about that you had some involvement in dealing with that doesn't get talked about as often as maybe it should be, especially considering it's sort of a success story in the long run, is the Farc Insurgency in Colombia. Could you talk to us a little bit about when you first sort of put your hands on that problem set and your perceptions of it, how that evolved during your time in office?
Sure. So, I had global responsibility for operations and the full breadth of the department's operational capabilities. And so the two things I really focused on in Latin America, since most of my attention was al-Qa'ida and the wars in the Middle East and Iran's nuclear program and things like that. And then for the modernization parts of the portfolio, still the rise of China, and then later dealing with a troublesome Russia. But in Latin America, it was really Colombia with the Marxist insurgency and then the drugs coming out of there, and then Mexican drug cartels. Those were the two big areas for me there. And, my engagement with Colombia goes back to my time as essentially a troop commander as in the 3rd of the 7th Special Forces when my two ODAs were tasked with collecting intelligence in case we needed to do hostage rescues of a taken over embassy, and Colombia was on that list, along with El Salvador and lots of others. And then the threat was a terrorist group called M19, although the FARC was still around. And, M19 had done a bunch of takeovers. But then, the problem in Colombia morphed into the drug problem with Pablo Escobar and others. And so special operations forces played a pretty big role in beating back that threat in the late 80s and 90s. And then finally, the Farc Insurgency, which had been around since the 1960s, and another group called the ELN, really was on the gates of, or at the gates of Bogota at the end of the Clinton administration. They had controlled a lot of the country and were intermixed with the druggies. And so that started Plan Colombia at the end of Clinton, and then the beginning of the George W. Bush. A lot of military assistance and small numbers of special operations advisors and then others with the Colombian National Police, including some retired special forces people that I had served with back in the day. And with the election of Alvaro Uribe as the president, I think it was 2003 or so, and the expansion of Colombia's armed forces, they gradually started pushing the FARC back. And so my involvement really started as a senior policy official in 2008, about a year into the job as an assistant secretary, when we had the opportunity to resolve a hostage crisis. 3 American Northrop Grumman employees were being held there for 5 years. And by the FARC deep in Colombia's interior, and along with former presidential candidate Ingrid Betancourt and 11 Colombian soldiers. And the Colombian Special Forces devised a really brilliant plan to trick the FARC into handing them over to what they thought was an NGO, and actually rescued those 15 people. So my first trip to Colombia must have been almost 30 years, 25 years at that point, was really to oversee the preparations of this operation. And then to talk about strategy for dealing with the FARC. And I should also mention the third leg of the stool was some of the FARC leaders were deep in Colombia's interior, but some were in Venezuela and some were in Ecuador. And the Colombians, with our assistance, had just done a strike on a leader in Ecuador, right in the border region. And there was volumes of intelligence gathered from that then I wanted to talk to the Colombians about their successful precision strike and a campaign against the FARC leadership, but also the big intelligence take that we had just gotten. And so over the next 4 years, every couple of years, I would meet with top Colombian officials, particularly a minister of defense who remains a good friend to this day, Juan Carlos Pinzon, to dismantle the FARC even more. So within a period of 10, 12 years, the FARC went down from having 20,000 troops to a few thousand or so, and then started the peace negotiations that occurred over the last several years.
How did that happen? Was it strictly like direct action? Were there civilian operations? How does that happen to take an organization like the FARC from 20,000 to 2,000 or whatever those numbers were?
Well, one, it was the expansion of the Colombian armed forces to push deeper into the Colombian hinterlands, and the national police, which is very good, and police intelligence. And I don't want to say his name, but the head of national police intelligence was a good friend of mine as well, who really ran a great organization. And then there was a precision strike campaign against the FARC leaders. that is really a combination. It's sort of like our Predator campaigns against al-Qa'ida, combination of great intelligence with precision weapons. And it took a number of them off the battlefield, even if they were in adjacent countries, but mostly deep in Colombia's interior. And then our special operations advisors, both with the police and with the military, and working with both conventional forces and the special operations forces, also helped push down the FARC. And then, at the end of the day, it was also an amnesty program to reintegrate people who didn't, want to live in the jungle forever and wanted their kids to go to school, and and whatever reason they joined this Marxist insurgency, 20 years ago, they didn't want that to be their whole life. And so combination of those things really helped reduce the FARC's influence dramatically.
Is a pretty stark change from, if you think back to, I guess, the late 90s or early 2000s, some people speculated that Colombia would become our next Vietnam. And
yes.
It turned out very differently.
Turned out very differently. And one of the big lessons of it is that, one, we did that with assistance and with, 100 or so special operators at a time advising. So really highly leveraged without, a big war on our part. And then second, it took 45 years.
Yes.
It wasn't, and it had ups and downs. It wasn't something that was won overnight.
Right.
The end game, the last decade was decisive and all in the right direction. But before that, there had been all kinds of things, and, being the drug capital of the world. And so, it shows the value of strategic persistence.
Yeah, the military to military relationship goes back to like the Korean War, I believe.
Yes, they fought in Korea, and after they had largely beaten back the FARC, they helped other governments with trainers and other things, exporting their now greater military capability.
Do you think we would have been as interested if it was not a Marxist movement, if it was just a criminal movement?
If it posed a real national security threat, I mean, because that's a really good question, because there were other places. I spent a lot of time in Central America in the early 80s when that was a major foreign policy focus. It was beset by criminal problems, but I had too many other things on my plate to, even the nostalgia I felt for the region, to spend much time there. So Mexico, because it was a big country and the drug problem became a national security threat, not only for the effects it was having on the United States, and today even worse with fentanyl, but the destabilizing effects it was having in Mexico. That the government might actually fall and it might become a failed narco state. And so that in Colombia really, really got my attention.
Do you feel that at any point in time, because people on not just different sides of the aisles, but just people of different opinions will call out for different things. Do you see at any point in time where the cartels that are active in Mexico right now will be deemed like a national security threat to the point of the same type of intervention?
Well, in a sense of, the relationship with Mexico has been a little more politically dicey than ours with Colombia, to say the least. But we have provided assistance to them both with training and intelligence to help them go after the cartels. It's a big business, and the cartels are formidable military organizations, and there's plenty of them. And so this is not something that can be won in a day. One of the things I point out in the book is we took some of our counterterrorism lessons and applied it to the cartels and had success in enabling Mexican special operations forces to capture or kill cartel leaders, but it barely put a dent in the problem, because other cartels move in and decapitation as a strategy in this area is just not very good. You actually have to, own the territory at the end of the day and, really reduce or eliminate as much as you can the organizations. And that's tough, and it took us time in Colombia. Mexico's a tougher problem, and things like fentanyl make it still a tougher problem yet, because you don't have to have these big growing areas or, other things.
Right.
The other thing I wanted to ask you about from this time period around 2009, you write in your book about playing a part in the approval process to have more Predator orbits pushed to Pakistan. And I want to ask you a little bit about, you had this previous experience launching covert operations into Afghanistan from Pakistan. Now it's sort of the other way around, and you're in Afghanistan launching covert operations into Pakistan, even if it's a quite public campaign. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that experience and about the Predator program around that time frame.
Sure. So, the Predator is developed in the late 90s as an earlier version of the aircraft is used in the Balkans. And then it makes its first flight over Afghanistan in September 2000. And actually, a Predator then sees Usama Bin Laden at a camp near Kandahar in southern Afghanistan, but it's not armed. And so then that starts the idea that, we need these aircraft, and we need them to not just have sensors on them, but weapons, so that when you get an opportunity to strike, you can do it. But then, 9/11 happens, and we have the invasion of Afghanistan, and Predator plays a little role in that conflict. It helps take out al-Qaeda's number 3, Mohammed Atef, in Kabul with a Marine fighter aircraft, providing the final strike. And then between 2004 and 2008, there's some or 2007, there's some Predator strikes in the Pakistan border region, as al-Qaeda had fled into Pakistan, first into the cities, and then came back into the border region where it was more secure. Predator started to be used a little bit there, as well as helping our special operators in Iraq against al-Qaeda in Iraq, and in Afghanistan against the Taliban. And in 2006, we have a very worrisome development. The threat to the American homeland goes way up, but we have this transatlantic airliner plot where a number of operatives in the United Kingdom plan to blow up 10 airliners en route to the United States and kill 3,000 plus people. And it's broken up by good intelligence in Pakistan. The leader of this is in Pakistan, and he gets killed in a Predator strike a couple years after that, 2008, Rashid Rauf. But that then triggers, we have to start denying this sanctuary. And so President Bush tasked the Department of Defense, and Secretary Gates tasked me in particular, and then the Counterterrorism Center at CIA, to come up with a joint strategy to go after this sanctuary between 2007 and 2008. And Predator is very central to that, to do the surveillance of these al-Qaeda operatives and leaders in the region. But also, we had developed a campaign to do special operations raids that would be cross-border, a couple of other things, and then joint capture operations with the Pakistanis to try to seal off the kill zone, if you will, to where they'd be vulnerable to these things. And the Pakistanis thought, we did one raid in 2008. They thought it was a violation of their sovereignty. The Pakistani people would question, how come, a military is invading us, so to speak, when we've got a big army that we're paying for. But the Predator was a capability they didn't have. And so they continued to support that. And so with some innovations that we really broadened our target list, we expanded the number of orbits dramatically. So we went from a couple of orbits. An orbit is, keeping one aircraft 24/7 over a target area. So you may need 3 to make one, or 2 to make one, depending on the distances. And then we went up to 8 first, and then eventually 14, and then more for Yemen and other parts of the world. So it became our really strategic counterterrorism war instrument, and it produced really great results. Suddenly, we're taking a lot of top al-Qaeda leaders off the battlefield from 2008 to 2012, about 50 plus overall in that border region, and then more in Yemen and elsewhere as well.
And I remember, the program in Pakistan being pretty intensely criticized at the time, concerns about collateral damage. But in time, it does seem like it effectively hollowed out the al-Qaeda organization to the point where, by the time we get to like 2011, they're trying to send their guys to Syria to start up something there because they're not effective in Pakistan.
Yeah, it's exactly right. One of the things that keeps al-Qaeda alive after 2012, is that they were able to create these franchises elsewhere in Yemen and Syria and Somalia and North Africa. It gave them longer life, but and Iraq for a while as well with al-Qaeda in Iraq. And the civilian casualties bit is one that's subject to huge disagreement. There are a number of private organizations, NGOs internationally and domestic, who claim that a few thousand civilians were killed or so. The U.S. government released numbers in 2016, and the number is somewhere between the low 60s to maybe 100, with 2,500 al-Qaeda operatives taken off the battlefield and 50 plus top leaders. So it's about as precise as you can make an air campaign as you can get, 98%, something just taking out a combatant, and sometimes we would wait for a couple of months to strike an al-Qaeda leader when he got away from his family, just waiting until the opportunity came, in close proximity or something. So, it's about as precise as you can make it.
And by the time we get to 2010, you had this new offer to go over to USDI. Could you tell us a little bit about how that came about?
Sure. So the first thing that happened is, when I was asked to come into the Bush administration, I thought it would be for 2 years. Typically when you serve at a high level, and I wasn't a political person, but when you serve at a high level in an administration, you're assumed that when the administration's done, you're done. And then President Obama asked Secretary Gates to stay on, and then Jim Clapper, who was USDI at the time and later became our Director of National Intelligence, and then me as the Assistant Secretary for Solic and IC. And so then in 2010, so that was unusual to have, people in very senior positions transition from Republican to Democrat or vice versa. And then in 2010, when Clapper became DNI, they asked me to become the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. And so then I was actually for 6 weeks because the Congress wasn't confirming people, and they said I would be confirmed unanimously. They had me do both jobs. And then I got just as soon as the Congress came back, they confirmed me unanimously. And I was USDI from early 2011 on.
So same question, I'm afraid, for people who are not in intelligence community, national security circles. What is USDI? What is the important role that they play?
Yeah, so this was a post 9/11 innovation, like the Director of National Intelligence. Didn't exist before. So Solic, created in the late 1980s. USDI was created in 2002, 2003. And then the Director of National Intelligence, 2005. And the logic behind USDI, this is something that Secretary Rumsfeld wanted a lot, was he had, 70% of the intelligence community, all of the big agencies except CIA and others who were part of other government departments, mostly staff organizations, except for Justice, where you had, FBI and Drug Enforcement Administration. And and no one really overseeing this in the Pentagon. So everything concerning defense intelligence would have to come up to the Deputy Secretary of Defense or Secretary. And so he wanted, given we were in a big intelligence war, they wanted to create this organization, and they did. I was the third Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, and the Undersecretary is also dual-hatted as the Director of Military Intelligence, Defense Intelligence, under the Director of National Intelligence too, because the relationship with the DNI is important. They're shared resources. The DNI directs the National Intelligence Program, the USDI directs the Military Intelligence Program, but all those defense agencies, the National Security Agency, the Defense Intelligence Agencies, they work for both masters, both the Secretary of Defense through the USDI and the DNI. And so that relationship with the DNI is very important.
And I think I confused myself earlier talking about oversight and AG capability. That's actually USDI that sends the IGs down to different places, correct?
Well, there's a separate intelligence oversight executive that really is just aimed at making sure compliance that's separate from USDI.
Oh, really?
But it's very small. USDI's job is more the budget and capabilities and of these defense intelligence organizations. So not only the big four, NGA, NSA, NRO, and DIA, but all the intelligence organizations of the military services and combatant commands. So it's roughly an $80 billion budget, a couple 100,000 employees, a mix of civilians and military, about half and half or so. And it's a big enterprise, the defense intelligence enterprise. And then, given that I had been a policymaker and had served on top White House committees, deputies committees, and others, they asked me to continue that role too. So I continued kind of the counterterrorism portfolio for the Bin Laden raid and our Predator campaigns against al-Qa'ida and all that, which was something that previous USDIs hadn't done. But I was asked to continue.
You had been SF, you had been CIA. How familiar were you with DIA and the human side of the military up until that point?
So from a special forces perspective, I was, and then a little bit from my CIA days, but I was a consumer of the NRO's products and NSA's products and stuff. And then now I had more responsibility to build their capabilities. What's the next generation of satellites going to look like? How do we stay ahead of so we can continue to break codes and collect different types of communications, as you go to faster and faster and higher volume communication systems, fiber optics, you go from 10G a second to 100G or whatever, you got to keep up with that.
What's the learning curve like that for somebody coming?
Well, I'd already dealt with nuclear weapons and
Yeah.
stealth bombers and lots of other stuff from my special forces and CIA days. So this was just another area, but there is a steep learning curve for those things. That's true. And fortunately, again, having the interdependent capabilities added onto the Solic made me, as an assistant secretary, even though I didn't oversee intelligence, to deal with those organizations a lot as a customer. So that helped. I had 4 years of kind of understudy.
Yeah.
And I gotta ask, of course, you write in your book that, we're getting around this time frame, that you were one of the very first people under DOD that got read on that we think we have something on high value target number one. And I was wondering if you could tell us what that experience was like, what it was like going through all of that and kind of the lead up to the strike itself.
Sure. So one of the main reasons I was brought back into government was to deal with the growing al-Qaida threat, which with our predators and other things, and in addition to a lot of other duties. But Bin Laden was certainly on my mind a lot. And, it took us 9 years to find him after he escaped from the Tora Bora Mountains in December 2001. And, and sort of piece by piece to learn how he communicated with al-Qaida through a courier, who that courier was, where he was located, and then finally to be able to geolocate him and follow him back to that compound. And so in 2007, when I became an assistant secretary, Bin Laden was thought to be somewhere in northern Pakistan, but a big ellipse that could be all along the border region, north to south, to then east to west a bit too. And there were cells working, or teams working on finding him, but we weren't super close. We first learned the nom de guerre, or kunya in Arabic, of his courier, and then a few years later learned his ethnic identity and true name, where he was from, and then about him and his family. And then he was very operational security conscious. He wouldn't turn on his phone until he was 90 minutes away from Bin Laden's house. And so there were a couple of glimpses of him, but not enough to fix him, as we say, to track him back to the compound. And so a year before we actually found him, we had one of those, and I thought, oh my goodness, we got him, and then we lost him, and it was very high and then very low. And then sure enough, several months later, I was called into a special meeting with the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs. The deputy CIA director was briefing the two of us that they think they had found Bin Laden in late August 2010. And so this was a series of briefings of how they did it and all the habits, and then what we learned about the house once we saw the house, and even some glimpses of Bin Laden walking around a courtyard. We ended up seeing him 5 times before the raid that actually killed him in early May 2011. But all that was presented, and I thought, now we're going to get him. So that was my first reaction, that very likely he's there. It wasn't definitive, but it seemed very likely he was there. And at the same time, the vice chairman and I were being briefed. The Secretary of Defense and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs were being briefed by Leon Panetta, the CIA director. And so the 4 of us was it for the entire Department of Defense. So there were a handful of people in the White House with the, president, vice president, and very top officials, people working on it at CIA, very, very small group, and with support from NSA and NGA. And then the 4 of us in the Department of Defense. And that was it for the U.S. government for some months.
Because they wanted a military option.
No, more as policymakers, but there could be a military option. So from the time I was read in the early fall of 2010 until the end of the 2010, we just focused on the intelligence case and trying to get more intelligence, which we did get some, not as much as we would have liked. But and then right before Christmas, President Obama's National Security Advisor, Tom Donilon, on direction of the president, told Leon Panetta that he wanted to start looking at operational options. So I was called over to CIA with a small team to start developing these operations. Do we do it unilaterally, or do we do it with the Pakistanis? Do we do a ground raid, or do we do an airstrike? And fleshing the pros and cons and how we would do this. What kind of raid do we do? How do we infiltrate to the target area, et cetera, and putting this together. And then progressively, and so then at one point then for the raid option, Secretary Panetta says we need now to look at a military option, and we need to bring in Admiral Bill McRaven, the commander of the Joint Special Operations Command. So I call Bill up, who was in Afghanistan at the time, and say, please come to Washington. We got to brief you on something. And he and I go to CIA, and they give him the briefing that I had gotten some months earlier. And then he starts developing feasibility with a couple planners. And then at CIA, we build a mock-up of the facility so that if we do decide to start looking at a military option, we have that ready for the force. And then the force is assembled in second half of March to this facility, and they get briefed on it for the first time. You know, the hand-picked force that's going to go do the ground operation, or possibly if the president approves it. And at the same time, we had gone to war with Libya. And so when they were called in, they thought they were going to Libya for WM, weapons of mass destruction or something else. And when the CIA briefer said, we believe we found Bin Laden, and then Admiral McRaven tells them, and we're here to rehearse a plan to go get him. Let's get to work. You know, wow. You could have heard a pin drop. But and then we had 5 meetings with the president from mid-March till the end of April to brief him on both in detail on the intelligence and then on the options. And so initially, some of the top leaders in our government, the president and Secretary of Defense and others, favor a B-2 strike on the compound. And so I spend a couple of weeks with planners with the B-2 wing about, you know, what we would need on that to hit that target. And it turned out, because we didn't know what was underneath it or tunnels or hardened stuff, we needed 32 2,000-pound bombs, 64,000 pounds of explosives. And so needless to say, when you looked at that, you know, every woman and child in that house would have been killed, along with the 4 males, Bin Laden, his son, and the courier and his brother. And neighbors in the area would have been killed, and then others would have had their, you know, houses damaged and windows and other things. And so that option was taken off the table while we continued to develop the raid option. A drone strike was substituted in case we could get Bin Laden walking around that courtyard. Mm-hmm. And those are the 2 options that the president looked at the end.
And you mentioned in your book that you brought up or reminded Admiral McRaven about a special helicopter program that sounds like it was near and dear to your heart that you had supervised.
Yeah. So we had some specially configured helicopters that had a better chance of infiltrating a force to the target without going into detail. And, you know, that we hadn't used them yet. Mm-hmm. And the test of that would be, you know, with the special configuration of them, would they have the carrying capacity of a standard helicopter and go the distance? Because, you know, it was a 90-minute flight, you know, 150 plus miles to get to the target from Afghanistan. So it was a long helicopter flight. And so we started working through that, but it ended up being the right decision.
And so as the plan is refined, you're going through rehearsals, you're getting closer and closer to, you know, D-Day, essentially, on this operation. And I think Obama wrote in his memoirs, as I recall, hearing all the information, getting all of the briefings, and the president eventually getting to the point where saying, guys, stop making up numbers in regards to percentages of likelihood that he's there. It kind of comes down to a flip of the coin and authorizing the operation. I'd love to hear, you have this great picture in the book of yourself in the Situation Room as with the president and vice president as this operation's happening. Can you tell us what it was like to come into work that day in an absolute cloak of secrecy and to sit down in the room with all of these folks on the National Security Council and the president and actually witness this thing go down?
Sure. So as I said, we had lots of meetings with the deputies and principals, and lots of plan rehearsals with the operational force, and I had lots of separate meetings at CIA on things. But when the president finally made the decision first to deploy the force, and then a few days before the raid, heard from all his advisors, and some were for the raid, others were for the drone strike, and others were for doing nothing, just waiting. So it was, it was a very gutsy decision by the president. He didn't have unanimity among his team. The deputies were more, not completely unanimous, but 90% unanimous that we ought to do the raid. And as you mentioned, there were different assessments, probability assessments about whether bin Laden was there, from 50% to 95%. I was at 85 myself, but it's a made up number. I mean, to be honest with you, it just means, you look at all the evidence and you think it's highly likely, or it's better than average, it's likely. But as you mentioned, President Obama said, okay, 50-50, it's still way better than we've had the last 10 years. And Leon Panetta said, the American people knew what we knew. They would want us to go forward. And, so 50 became 85 or 90. It really didn't matter. We were going to go. And so that last weekend, we had all-day meetings at the White House, first with the deputies and then the principals. And the raid was postponed a day. It was supposed to be a Saturday night and ended up shifting to Sunday because of bad weather. And so we all then had to go to this White House Correspondents' Dinner. And that was excruciating, to be at this comedy fest and stuff, which was very good comedy. Black tie, tuxedo and everything. And all I could think about is get this over with so we can get on to the raid and, get some justice for the American people. And then the morning of the raid, we have another meeting at the White House to go over last minute things. And again, nobody on my staff knows a thing about this. There's a handful of people at the top of Pentagon. I have to brief the general counsel in at the last minute. So there's some legal things we had to do. And the very, very just top officials, the chairman, the vice chairman, the secretary of defense, and I had gotten the undersecretary for policy read in, Michelle Flournoy. And so, I get in my car, go to the Pentagon, get some papers, and then decide to pause at the 9/11 memorial for a bit. We have benches for each of the victims, the 184 that lost their lives in the plane crash, and just wanted to sit there and collect my thoughts before I went to the White House about, why we were doing this raid. And it seemed like a good idea to me. And then went to the White House, and then the operation was done under CIA authorities. So then went to CIA that afternoon, a handful of us, the director, the deputy director, director for operations and counterterrorism center, and then some of our other intelligence organizations chiefs who were involved directly in the operation, or a few of their people were, and then Admiral Eric Olson from the head of Special Operations Command. And so we monitored the operation in real time from CIA for some 4 hours or so, for the long flight in, the long flight out, the 38 minutes on target. And then when it was over, then went to the White House that night. And so that photo is a long-winded answer to the question, but that photo was taken Sunday night after the raid was successfully done, and at the White House, and talking about it with the president and vice president and others, but also then getting the president ready for his address to the nation much later that night, and then the briefing on background to the press that we would do after that, which there was 5 of us, and from the political aspects of it to the intelligence to the military, and I was the Stuckey as the briefer for the military part of the operation, which you couldn't say much. And so he just said, flew in a helicopter, we killed him, we flew back out, we don't have any casualties, he's dead. That's about it. So.
Can you mentioned that it was done under CIA authorities. Can you tell our audience why that is, what the difference is between the CIA authorities and the military authority?
Yeah, so there are different parts of the U.S. law. CIA is called Title 50 of the U.S. Code, and the Armed Forces of the United States are Title 10. So people abbreviate it as Title 10 or Title 50, which means the broad authorities given to the Secretary of Defense or the Director of the CIA. And so if you were doing it under military authorities, the chain of command would go from the President to the Secretary of Defense to typically the combatant commander, the central command commander in this case, then to the operational commander, who's executing the mission. If it's done under CIA authorities, it's the president to the director of the CIA directly. And then if he's using a military force, if any military capabilities are detailed over to CIA, because CIA doesn't have that, for example. And so we have provisions to be able to do that sort of thing. Then it's from the president to the CIA director to the operational commander, nothing in between. And, and the reason you choose the natural one, the overwhelming one for military force is, through the defense chain of command. The reason you would choose CIA, and the president with his advisors recommending did it in this case, is if we went in and did a raid, because we didn't have proof that bin Laden was there. We had a really strong circumstantial case. So if we went in and did the raid and it turned out to be some crazy drug lord or, who knows who was living in this house, and then we got out without making a big commotion, that it would, given this was deep in the heart of Pakistan and kind of a resort town, that, it would be a little more deniable than if we did it, under Department of Defense authority. So that was one of the reasons why we went the CIA route.
So does that only matter, or in this case?
Keep it quiet, I should say, rather than deniable, but just keep it quiet.
So in this case, did it only matter if the mission was a bust? If
a clean bust.
Yeah.
And if it were a messy bust, you'd have the same problem.
Right.
But we're a clean bust. So as it turned out, because we had the helicopter that had the hard landing and was damaged and couldn't fly out, we had to blow it up. Even though we didn't have casualties or anything, that made it messier, and that forced the president to then change it from a covert action to a military action after the fact, and say, basically, I'm declassifying the fact that the United States did this, just that fact, and then I can talk about it. If I'm the president, I can give my speech to the nation then.
So there are some authors out there that are very grateful that the helicopter went down.
Yeah.
I have loads more questions, but if we have viewer questions for Mr. Vickers, we should probably try to get to some of those.
Yeah, so we have a couple left over from last show that we promised the folks would get to. And then, so let me get to these real quick. And then we have a couple more for tonight. And then, D, were there any on Patreon?
Yeah, there's a few.
So I think so from last week, from Tom K, thank you very much. What is your take on Iran, its negative influence on the Middle East, and potential actions to take?
So Iran is definitely a malign influence in the Middle East and sometimes elsewhere. It wants to be the hegemon of its region and destabilize others. It also sees itself as the defender of Shiites around, and so it's built up substantial proxy forces and Hezbollah in Lebanon, and now and Shiite militias and Kataib Hezbollah and others in Iraq. the Houthis in Yemen. It's allied with Syria. And then even non-Shia groups like Hamas, it's supported as part of its revolutionary Islamic front. And so it's been a destabilizing force in the Middle East since the Iranian Revolution. And, our objectives with Iran are really severalfold. One, to prevent them from getting nuclear weapons, because if they did, all the trouble that they cause now would be magnified. They'd feel more emboldened to do it if they thought you couldn't invade them because of you would risk nuclear retaliation. And then also to try to deal with this malign influence to get them to stop, which in some cases means shoring up our allies in the region, their defenses against missiles and other things. In other cases, it means working to undermine the Iranian regime or other things inside Iran. And, the challenge with these things is that you're unlikely to solve this problem until there is a change of regime. American presidents really don't want to invade Iran and take on that burden of occupying it. And if you did do a strike against their nuclear weapons complex, you would set them back a few years, but you might even make them more likely then to want to have them eventually. And so it's a difficult problem and a work in progress. You can't just let them run free because, as we see right now, allied with Hamas, their aim is to destabilize the Middle East and, get rid of Israel and lots of other things. And also take shot and get the U.S. out of the Middle East, so taking shots at our soldiers who are deployed in the region and others. And so they're going to do that. And if you show weakness, they're just going to continue doing
Right.
it. So it's a tricky issue with them to make sure we're doing enough to put them on their back foot without necessarily an all-out war.
Do you feel that that the targeted strikes, like against Soleimani, that the other like targeted strikes when they're outside their area, do you feel like those are a step forward in deterrence, step backwards in deterrence?
Yeah, I mean, Soleimani had a lot of American blood on his hands, supporting militia groups that killed several hundred Americans, and he was getting bolder and bolder, and kind of getting a pass. He traveled around the Middle East pretty freely. But it's a difficult decision, in a way to do the strike because, then what are you going to get back down the road? And,
right.
But given the blood he had on his hands and his efforts to destabilize the Middle East, and that, yes, he's replaced, but he won't necessarily be replaced by an equally ambitious and
right.
guy. So I think it was a good decision.
Yeah. Andrew Dunbar, thank you very much. Given the recent events in Guyana, and Venezuela, Guyana, what do you think the chances are that foreign influence is pushing it, or Maduro is just going bonkers?
Iranians and Russians have pretty significant influence, and Cubans in Venezuela, and with the old Chavez regime, and then now Maduro, and Chinese as well. But I don't know, but I suspect this is internally Venezuela. Venezuela is a resource-rich country with talented population, and they've managed to run it into the ground. And so, trying to take some resources from a neighbor who doesn't have much of a military probably seems like a good idea to them. One of the sad things is Guyana has been a poor country, and then they discover this oil and gas and stuff off their coast, and a chance to improve their prosperity. And big Venezuela next door says, "Thank you very much. I think I'll want that." So
yeah.
We'll see what happens, but it's clearly a case of a bully saying, that's a nice lunch you have there,
Right.
schoolboy.
You mentioned we don't talk about Cuba that often. We've talked to like Mark Polymeropoulos about the Havana syndrome, and we don't really see Cuba, I think, in our national news as competitors. We see Russia, China, and Iran, but we just had the big
A diplomat.
the
get
big
arrested.
diplomat indicted for. Do you think that Cuba flies? Do you think that they're a bigger threat than what the U.S. populace thinks they are, or are they just getting successful on sort of one-off type things?
So during the Cold War, they had a very formidable intelligence service when they recruited a number of these people, spy in DIA for many years, this ambassador for 4 decades, another senior State Department official that was caught, I think, a couple decades ago or something, but has been spying for several decades. And so they've done pretty well. And then, they fomenting insurgency in Latin America, but particularly Central America in the 80s, sent 20,000 troops to Angola. We ended up defeating them there with the opposition. But, they were punching above their weight, like some other Soviet allies. And what really hurt Cuba was at the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union cut off all its subsidies and stuff. And so that caused the regime to really retrench pretty dramatically, in its ambitions, but it really didn't go away. And so over time, the Russians have kind of expanded again there. The Chinese are interested in it as an intelligence platform, et cetera. So I wouldn't, it's not to the level of threat that it was in the Cold War as a significant Soviet proxy for extending Soviet power, but it's more formidable, I think, today than it was 25 years ago after the Cold War, when it was, flat on its back for a while. So it's, it bears attention to, and it's something that shouldn't just be ignored because they don't have our interests at heart.
Yeah, because we also had that DIA officer arrested in like 2001. Mohammed
Anna Montes.
Yeah. Mohammed Savani, thank you very much for the generous donation. As an investor, what can American companies do, and what should foreign policy be regarding the plague $500 billion annual intellectual property and innovation theft by China because of the 50% plus equity requirement?
Yeah, great question. So one, I think, Chinese economy has been stumbling lately. Xi Jinping, has been prioritizing political control over economic growth and innovation, and hurting the future, and kind of going against Chinese strategy over the last 4 decades, which is, hide your capabilities and bide your time, be pals with the West and get investment until you really are more powerful, don't peak too soon. And he may be doing some of that, but China's done remarkably well with intellectual property theft. During the Cold War, where we had really non-integrated economic systems between the East and the West, and the Soviets would try to steal technology, and occasionally they'd be successful, and we'd frustrate them from time to time with things as we learned about them. And I looked at that and I thought, one, communism produces a crappy economy, but, you're not going to steal your way to economic prosperity. You just can't compete in that world against people who are inventing stuff all the time and, have the freedom and the capital to do it. With China's made me rethink that. One, because of their integration with the West and access to capital, but two, it's so much easier to steal these days with cyber than the Soviets ever could have, where you physically got to get the good and smuggle it someplace. And so they've done rather well. And, something we have to harden our defenses against and restrict new technologies from going there, much as we did during the Cold War. I also think that over the long haul, whether the United States remains the leading power in the international system 30 years from now, or whether it's China, will depend on our economic might and our technological innovation. And so that's where your caller's comments, that really is the core of U.S. grand strategy. If we get that right and we create a prosperous, very healthy and unified and ambitious society, we on the national security side will do our parts in defense and intelligence to make sure we stay number one. If we fail in that economic and technological competition, we're going to have a much tougher time.
How, and I know that counterintelligence isn't necessarily your focus bailiwick, but how do you fight like the Chinese threat and not, the threat in our institutions, the threat in our companies, things like that, and not be presented as a racist, like an anti-Chinese, but more an anti-CCP focused country?
Yeah, so the FBI is maligned a lot these days, but it really has a tough mission. Its mission has expanded dramatically. So one, you have all this cyber crime and intellectual property theft that is a new challenge to us. Two, you have a lot of spies. You have Russian spies and Chinese and others, and so the counterintelligence problem has grown. And then you have domestic and foreign extremists, and the foreign one is down a bit. The domestic one has risen, unfortunately, and so they've got a challenge. They've got a much more diverse counterintelligence challenge than they had. And if I were king for a day, I would be trying to build up that agency and give them more resources, not less, because the domestic environment's gotten a lot tougher, and part of it is counterintelligence. And the Chinese target a lot American-born Chinese, because some of them have relatives, and also they're if you look at our top companies, particularly our top tech companies, they're led by either recent or semi-recent immigrants here. We're very fortunate as a country to have these people from India or China, Taiwan, wherever it is, that have come here and built great, got an education here in engineering or science or whatever, and have built fantastic companies. But they're targeted, and lower level employees are targeted, by China, much as the Soviets a lot of times in the past would target Eastern European emigres and others who, still had family behind the Iron Curtain.
Yeah. Joey Holt, thank you very much. You have to choose one. Who are you sending for the most difficult, dangerous hostage rescue mission, CAG or Dev Group? P.S. I know it's CAG.
Starting a food fight.
Yeah.
Oh, as a former assistant secretary overseeing it all, I love all my children, and I have to decline. They are both fantastic, and our units have, in some cases, different specialties where for some missions, one's the obvious choice, and for others, the other. But for a lot of them, they're interchangeable and fantastic and the best in the world.
Dee, do you want to hit the Patreon?
I don't have them.
Oh, you don't?
No.
Okay, hold on just a second. While I'm pulling up the Patreon, Mike, do you mind, for you, somebody who's been around for a very long time, are there threats that you see rising that Americans aren't aware of, that maybe America isn't focused on that they should be?
So I don't think it's necessarily a threat that comes out of the blue. I think it's not more a case of not accurately characterizing the threat. So in one case, it might come from a combination of threats that, you see them all individually, but you don't think they might gang up on you and really make a much tougher problem where the whole is greater than the sum of parts. So Iran, China, Russia, or two of them would pose challenges for us in a way that we haven't had to deal with in a long, long time, really since World War II. We thought about it a lot, but we've planned for different contingencies like that, but we haven't faced that really since then. And that would put a lot in play. And then I think um, these emerging technologies that I believe really are going to change the world for good and bad. Artificial intelligence, maybe quantum computing, synthetic biology for sure. And a lot of this debate is goofy in a sense, particularly in the AI sense of it's either going to do nothing or Terminator machines are going to kill all humans. And it's really going to be bad humans having machines do very bad things for them that is more likely the bigger threat to us than machines by themselves going against all humans or something. And you don't want to, and so for instance, while we're worried about bottling up AI and putting all the safeguards around it and everything else so it can't kill all humanity, someone else might be thinking, how do I serve my foreign policy objectives and defeat your military with this or do something else? And the same is true for biology. And biology is an area where people don't like to talk about it too much because it's going to cure diseases. It's going to do what's going to feed lots of people. It's going to do wonderful, wonderful things for humans, but it can also be used for very bad purposes, and it's not going to escape certain folks to think about that. And so it's really more like I said, the aspects of threats that people know something about, but not enough about, that I think is where we could be caught.
Right. David Eden, thank you very much. Question about the Angola Bush War. Last week when you said we beat the Cubans there, are you referring to the American support for UNITA,
Yes.
or something like that? I had the impression that there was little CIA involvement, but it was mostly South Africa who fought the Cubans in Angola.
No, so the South Africans were engaged from time to time, but supporting UNITA from 1986 on, if I remember right, after a thing called the Clark Amendment was repealed or something or other. But the last years of the Cold War was part of the Reagan doctrine, and the U.S. government had a pretty big role supporting Angolans against the Cubans.
I believe it was the second largest covert action program after Afghanistan.
Yeah, it was pretty good sized.
Duncan, Idaho, thank you very much. Love the book. And the book, if you guys have not read it, we highly recommend you do. By all means available. Love the book. You talk a lot about government oversight near the end. I have several questions, and I know you can't take them all. Feel free to pick and choose. So I'm going to ask the first two, Duncan. Do 127E operations undermine congressional oversight?
I don't think so. I don't know enough about that particular issue since I left in 2015, and we had different titles. But Congress generally puts, they give you the authorities for these things, and generally with their oversight. And so I don't, you can step beyond what's intended, as occasionally a government will do, and then get reined in after that. But generally, the creators of the law try to make sure that you don't overstep.
The interesting mechanism with 127E that differs from like the older 1208 or 1206 programs.
1208 and 1206 is what I know.
Well, under 127, a foreign partner actually opcons their military unit to our special ops advisors. That's the big difference between the two. That perhaps we use programs like that in places like Somalia.
Yeah, but I mean, 1208 kind of lets you do, that. Again, it wouldn't be necessarily a foreign. 1206 was train them. Mm-hmm. 1208 was use a non-governmental entity, essentially, of some kind or another under our direction. If I understand what you're saying correctly, that it's a foreign partner that's doing it. But, you still could be subject to other constraints. So I think the devil's in the details.
Yeah. And then, do you think any changes are needed for the eminent FISA 702 reauthorization? And it's not just a reauthorization, I think it's an expansion, isn't it?
I'm not sure.
I don't know that it's an expansion. I think they're putting some more guardrails around it. But 702 is a very important program. And, the reason for 702 is it's a feature of the design of the internet, which most global traffic, it's been declining in the past decade or so, but 80-90% of global traffic, no matter who the communicators are in the world, routes through the United States. And so that posed a legal challenge for us in a sense that, you have two foreigners in parts of the world talking to each other, two al-Qa'ida terrorists. Their communications, when, Muhammad sends it to the Ayman or whatever it is, that communication is going to go through the pipes, go through the United States. So unless the pipes have some special privileges, U.S. privileges, because they transit the United States when two foreigners' communications is riding on it, you don't want to deprive yourself of that intelligence. When you start using communications where an American is party to that, then the pipes aren't the issue so much, but then, you get into the FISA issue, the real FISA issues.
Right.
Court supervision, the warrants, and that's all appropriate.
Yeah.
And if that had been violated in certain cases, again, you have judges who review these things, the FISA court and stuff, but then that should be tightened up, or the standards of evidence. But broadly, because of the feature of global communications, 702 is essential. It's not an American program. It's a foreign intelligence program, principally.
Isaac, thank you. How can people achieve privacy, anonymity, and privacy in both online and IRL in real life? Also, how can they build and evolve their OPSEC?
So I think it's pretty tough. I mean, there's ways to do some, but generally, just from an intelligence officer, a clandestine intelligence officer's perspective, the challenge these days, and if you want to do normal business, is to hide in plain sight or hide temporarily for something, not to hide permanently.
Yeah.
We live in an age of surveillance capitalism. You make money by knowing a lot about people and their data, and it's just the world we live in. So this is a problem like AI and other things that governments will have to wrestle with for a while. You don't want to overregulate, but on the other hand, you do have basic privacy rights. And so whether things sunset at a certain period of time, that, you have you give up your privacy to be on social media or something, but it doesn't mean it should last forever.
Right.
Assuming you have a mechanism of enforcing that, these are issues governments have to wrestle with.
Do you think that our government at some point in time should look at sort of the European model of having, the right to forget, like if a consumer says,
maybe. I'm not an expert in that.
Yeah.
I do think it's important, but and again, you have a right to your data, and there's tools and things that can help you restrict some of that as well. I'm not an expert, so I don't really feel qualified to talk about it. But on the other hand, just a lot of it's out there, and it's so integral to the economy and the way we do in life, just the way we do business.
Yeah.
So, Mike, since you've left governmental service, had a great private sector career as well, received recipient of the Bill Donovan Award. Could you tell us, last question, what's next for Mike Vickers?
Oh, I don't know. I'm thinking about maybe a follow-on book, and I've got 7 grandchildren and maybe some more down the road. So I've got a full life right now, and my heart is in professionally in national security and contributing where I can contribute best. It's not everywhere, but if I were given the right opportunity and the right world situation to come back into government one more time before I'm absolutely too old, I'd welcome the chance.
Well,
that's for someone else to decide.
Mike, we support you being director of the CIA or ODNI. Like whatever you want, let us know, and we'll start calling people. We'll start an email campaign.
Well, I appreciate the sentiment. I guess I have 2 votes.
In the meantime, you wrote a terrific memoir. I hope folks will go and check it out. By all means, available. It's out now wherever books are sold. Ebook. Is there an audio book, Mike?
There is. There's
all right.
An audio. I narrated it myself.
Awesome.
So,
yeah, people love that.
Link is in the description.
Yeah, the link is down below in the description. Please check it out, folks. Mike, before we let you go, any final thoughts? Anything you'd like to put out there?
No, you guys are great, and it's a very comprehensive interview and subjects near and dear to my heart.
Thank you for doing it. Really appreciate your time on a Friday, 2 Friday evenings in a row. And next week you're going to be here with Mark Polymeropoulos, right?
An old friend. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you. We'll see you guys next Friday. Take care out there. Have a nice weekend.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Mike. We really appreciate it.
Sure.